What would you do if your mother-in-law told everyone you trapped her son, and the baby looked exactly like him? Pette had her mind made up about me from the very beginning. She was convinced Arlo could do better. She believed I wasn't attractive enough, successful enough, or worthy enough for her beloved son. She smiled warmly at me across family dinner tables, but the judgment was always there beneath the surface, cold and constant. She made remarks about my salary being insufficient. She made remarks about my apartment being too cramped. She made remarks about my family not carrying the same kind of social standing as theirs. Nothing she said was ever directly offensive. She was far too calculated for that, but the message was never unclear. I was beneath her son, and she was simply biding her time until he figured that out for himself. Arlo stood up for me every time he caught his mother's behavior. He told her I was the love of his life and that accepting me wasn't optional. She would apologize and genuinely seem to mean it. Then the next visit would arrive and the subtle jabs would resume right where they left off. I chose to ignore it because I loved Arlo deeply, and marrying him meant learning to live with her. I believed things would improve after the wedding. They got significantly worse. 2 years into our marriage, I found out I was pregnant. Arlo was overjoyed. He cried when I showed him the positive test and started designing the nursery before the day was over. He announced it to everyone he knew. His excitement was so pure and overwhelming that I fell in love with him all over again just watching it. Pette's response was something else entirely. When we shared the news at a family dinner, her face didn't change. No smile, no congratulations, nothing warm. She looked at me with flat, calculating eyes and asked how far along I was. 8 weeks, I told her. She counted backward on her fingers like she was cross-referencing a timeline, looking for a discrepancy. Then she said the timing was awfully convenient. Arlo asked what she meant. She changed the subject without answering. The rumors began after that dinner. Pette started working her way through the extended family, telling anyone who would listen that I had deliberately gotten pregnant to lock Arlo into the marriage before he could reconsider. She said women like me used pregnancies as insurance. She said Arlo was too trusting to recognize what I was doing, and someone needed to make him see the truth. I found out from Arlo's cousin at my own baby shower. She assumed I already knew. She assumed Arlo had already confronted his mother about it. He hadn't because Pette had been strategic, spreading her lies only to people she trusted not to report back to us. I told Arlo everything that night. He was furious. He called his mother immediately and demanded an explanation. She denied every word of it. She said his cousin must have misheard something. She said she would never dream of saying anything so hateful. She cried about being wrongly accused, and somehow, by the end of the call, Arlo was the one apologizing her. Our daughter arrived in spring. She looked exactly like her father from the very first moment. Same nose, same chin, same striking eye color that was distinctly his family, same small birthmark on her left shoulder that Arlo carried in the identical spot. The nurses remarked on it. The doctors joked that I had done all the work, and she came out as his carbon copy. Every person who visited said the same thing without being asked. Every person except Pette. When she came to the hospital, she held our daughter for less than a minute before passing her back. She said the baby looked small. She said the baby looked nothing like Arlo had at that age. She said resemblances often shift as babies grow. She quietly planted doubt in a room full of people who could clearly see the truth with their own eyes. Over the following month, Pette escalated. She began suggesting to extended family members that she wasn't entirely certain the baby was Arlo's. She implied I may have been unfaithful in past, off another man's child as her son's. She quietly recommended that Arlo request a paternity test before he grew too attached. She said these things to aunts, uncles, and cousins while smiling pleasantly at me across Sunday dinner tables. This time, too many relatives reported the same comments for Pette to deny. When Arlo confronted her again, she admitted she had concerns. She said a mother had a right to look out for her son. She said the baby simply didn't resemble him regardless of what everyone else claimed. She said a test would put her mind at ease, and if I had nothing to hide, I should be glad for the opportunity to prove her wrong. Arlo looked at his mother. Then he looked at our daughter sleeping in my arms. Our daughter who wore his exact face. He told his mother that needing a test despite the evidence directly in front of her meant she didn't actually trust him at all. He told her that demanding proof when the answer was sleeping right there showed she wanted to be right far more than she wanted a real relationship with her granddaughter. He told her that until she offered me a genuine apology and stopped spreading lies, she was no longer welcome in our home. Pette told him he was choosing me over his own mother. Arlo told her he was choosing his wife and daughter over someone unwilling to accept them. She walked out fully expecting him to call her within days and walk it back. He never called. Weeks passed, then months. With Pette out of our lives, everything became lighter. Imagigan started doing the small things that made my chest feel too full to hold. Grabbing her toes, making those soft sounds that weren't quite laughter yet but were close enough to count. Arlo would come through the door after work and her legs would kick the moment she heard his voice. We spent evenings on the floor with her between us, watching her discover her own hands like they were the most extraordinary things in existence. Nobody was questioning whether she belonged to him. Nobody was whispering lies about me. Nobody was making me feel like I had to justify my place in the room every time I entered it. My mom came over one Saturday with bags of groceries and that purposeful look she gets when she has decided someone needs taking care of. She made breakfast while I fed Imagigan, then shooed me toward the shower while she cleaned up. When I came back, she had Imagigan on a blanket doing tummy time and was making those warm, encouraging sounds that grandmothers make instinctively. I sat beside them and just watched for for a moment. My mom glanced over and her face softened into that expression that meant she was about to ask something I probably wasn't ready to answer. She asked how I was really doing, not the surface answer. The truth. Something about the gentleness in her voice broke something open inside me. I started crying right there on the living room floor. Not the graceful kind, but the kind where your face goes red and you can't catch your breath properly. She pulled me against her shoulder and held me while Imogen kicked contentedly on her blanket 3 feet away, completely unaware that her mother was falling apart. I told her I was exhausted from being the villain in a story I had never written. I had done nothing wrong except fall in love with a man whose mother had despised me on sight, and somehow I had become the bad person in the narrative. People still gave me strange looks at family events before we stopped attending them. People still whispered when they thought I was out of range. Pette had poisoned so many people against me so thoroughly that even with Arlo's support, I still felt the damage every single day. My mom held me tighter and said that Pette's lies revealed everything about Pette's character and absolutely nothing about mine. She said any reasonable person could look at Imogen and see immediately whose child she was. She said the people who chose accusations over visible evidence weren't worth my tears. She said I was a wonderful mother and a devoted wife, and Pette's jealousy and need for control were her burdens to carry, not mine. I cried harder because I had needed to hear that so desperately. Later that afternoon, after my mom had gone, Arlo's phone rang. It was Fletcher, and I could hear the tension tightening in Arlo's voice the moment he answered. He listened for a long time, his jaw growing harder with each passing second. When he hung up, he looked angrier than he had in weeks. Fletcher had called to warn us that Pette was circulating through the extended family again. She wasn't apologizing or acknowledging anything she had done. Instead, she was casting herself as the victim. She was telling people how deeply wounded she was. She was saying we were keeping her only grandchild from her for no legitimate reason. She was sobbing to aunts and uncles about how her son had chosen his wife over his own mother. She was carefully omitting every single thing she had done to create this situation. Arlo paced across the living room, his hands tight at his sides. His mother still believed she was the wronged party. She had spent months accusing me of trapping him with a pregnancy, months suggesting I had been unfaithful, months pushing for paternity tests when our daughter wore his face like a mirror image. And now she expected sympathy because he had finally drawn a line. I watched him pace and felt something solidify in my thinking. We had been reactive throughout this entire ordeal, always responding to whatever Pette did next. Perhaps it was time to take control of the story ourselves. I told Arlo we needed to shape the narrative before his mother twisted it beyond recognition. He stopped pacing and looked at me. I said we needed to tell people exactly what happened, not the careful, softened version, but the unvarnished truth about what she had said and done. He thought about it quietly for a moment. Then he nodded and picked up his phone, opening the family group chat. He spent 20 minutes composing the message, his thumbs moving quickly across the screen. When he showed me what he'd written, it was precise and thorough. He outlined exactly why we had established distance from his mother. He listed the accusations she had made about entrapment. He detailed the lies she had spread about my faithfulness. He described her demands for paternity tests, despite overwhelming evidence. He made it unambiguous that this estrangement was a direct result of her choices and her refusal to take genuine accountability. He sent it before either of us could reconsider. Responses came flooding in within minutes. Some family members offered their support and said they had suspected Pette wasn't being truthful. Others sent messages about forgiving family regardless of circumstances. A few admitted they hadn't realized the situation was that serious. Then River texted back, and I watched Arlo's face darken as he read it. His brother said we were being dramatic. He said Pette was simply concerned. He said mothers have the right to protect their sons. Arlo typed back fast, his frustration showing in each word. He said their mother had accused his wife of infidelity and deliberate entrapment. That wasn't concern. Those were serious accusations that had actively damaged my reputation. He said River minimizing what happened showed exactly why they needed space from the broader family situation. The argument went back and forth until Arlo muted the conversation and set his phone on the couch. 3 weeks later, Imogen began sleeping through the night consistently, 7 to 8 hours straight. I woke up one morning actually feeling rested for the first time since she was born. I could think clearly again. I felt like myself returning in pieces. I took her to her 6-month checkup on a Thursday morning. The pediatrician checked her weight and measurements and ran through the standard assessment. She noted how remarkably alert Imogen was, how well she tracked movement and responded to sound. She said Imogen was in perfect health and developing beautifully. Sitting there in that exam room, I felt a fierce surge of pride rise up through me. Despite everything with Pette, despite the lies and the family chaos and the sleepless stress, my daughter was thriving. I was doing something right. In the waiting room afterward, as I gathered the diaper bag and got ready to head out, someone said my name. I looked up and found one of Arlo's distant cousins standing nearby with a baby carrier in one hand, looking like she would rather be having any other conversation. She congratulated me on the baby but couldn't quite hold my gaze. Her eyes kept drifting sideways, to To the floor, to the reception desk, to some middle distance that wasn't my face. I understood immediately what was happening. She had heard Pette's version of events and hadn't yet decided what to believe. I could read it in her posture, in the careful surface-level questions, in the way she asked how old Imagigan was now while looking just past me. Something clicked into focus right there in that waiting room. I was done feeling ashamed of lies someone else had invented. I pulled out my phone and opened my photo gallery. I walked toward her and held the screen out, showing her recent pictures of Imagigan. The cousin looked down at the photos and her expression completely transformed. Her eyes went wide and her lips parted slightly. She looked from the screen to Imagigan in my arms and back again. She said she hadn't realized how strongly the baby resembled Arlo. She apologized for acting strangely, admitted she'd heard things, and said it was now obvious those things weren't true. She asked if she could see more. I showed her a dozen additional photos, each one highlighting another feature Imagigan shared unmistakably with her father. The cousin left looking embarrassed and thoughtful. That evening, after Imagigan was down for the night, I told Arlo about running into her. I said I was tired of Pette's lies continuing to shape how people treated me months after she'd been cut off. I was tired of seeing that flash of doubt in people's eyes. I was tired of defending myself against accusations that should never have existed in the first place. Arlo listened and suggested we start sharing more photos of Imagigan on social media in the family chat. He said we should let the visual evidence do the work. If people could see how completely she resembled him, Pette's lies would collapse under their own weight. We spent the next hour selecting photos from our gallery. We chose ones where Imagigan's face was clear and prominent, ones that highlighted her eye color, ones where the resemblance to Arlo was impossible to overlook or dismiss. We assembled a shared album and sent it to the extended family with a simple message about wanting to share their daughter's first 6 months. The response was instant and overwhelming. Family members began commenting within minutes, pointing out identical features. They said she had Arlo's nose, his chin, his eyes, his expressions. Old baby photos of Arlo appeared in the comments for comparison, and the similarities were striking. Several people sent private apologies, saying they should have known better than to entertain the accusations. The album spread beyond our immediate circle, cousins sharing it with parents, aunts forwarding it to uncles. And within a day, it seemed like everyone in Arlo's extended family had seen it. The following afternoon, Jacqueline texted to say the photos were circulating widely, and that people were questioning why they had ever believed Pette in the first place. Then she added the line that kept me awake that night. Pette had seen the photos and become very emotional. I turned Jacqueline's message over in my mind all night. Pette had become very emotional looking at the photos. Was she crying because she had finally confronted how wrong she had been? Or was she simply upset about missing out on the consequences of her own actions? The distinction mattered enormously. One was genuine remorse. The other was just regret about consequences. 2 days later, during dinner, Arlo's phone rang. He looked at the screen and went completely still. He answered, and I could make out Stuart's voice on the other end, loud enough to catch fragments even without the speaker on. Stuart said Pette had been crying without stopping since seeing Imagigan's recent photos. He said she wanted to come over and talk. He said they could be at our door in 20 minutes if we would just give them a chance. Arlo looked across the table at me. I shook my head. He told his father no. He said they were not welcome in our home until his mother took genuine accountability for what she had done. Stuart started pushing back. Arlo cut him off and said that spreading lies about me to the entire family wasn't something that could be undone with a single conversation. He said his mother had been given months of opportunities to apologize sincerely and had chosen instead to double down on her accusation. Stuart said Pette was suffering. Arlo said I had suffered too when his mother told everyone I was a cheating liar who had trapped him with someone else's baby. The call ended badly. Arlo sat staring at his plate after he hung up. Imagigan made a happy noise from her bouncer. He didn't look up. The days that followed were hard. Arlo came home each evening looking hollowed out. He would hold Imagigan for long stretches without saying much, his shoulders carrying a tension that never fully released. He barely touched his dinner. On Thursday, he came home 2 hours late. I had already fed Imagigan and put her down. He stepped through the door and just stood in the hallway. I asked what happened. He said a major project at work had collapsed. His boss had blamed him for a failure that wasn't his. He had spent the afternoon sitting through meetings being criticized for someone else's mistake. I hugged him and he leaned against me like he no longer had the energy to hold himself upright. We sat on the couch together and he pulled Imagigan's baby blanket onto his lap and held it, staring at nothing. I made him tea. He drank it cold an hour later, having forgotten it was there. That night in bed, he finally said what had been building inside him. He had been thinking about his mom. He asked if perhaps we were being too rigid by maintaining complete no contact. My stomach dropped instantly. Panic climbed up through my chest. I wasn't ready to open that door, but I also couldn't bear being the reason Arlo was silently suffering. I asked what he meant. He said maybe we could consider allowing his parents a visit if his mother offered a genuine apology. He said the arrangement was affecting him more than he had anticipated. He said he missed her even while still being angry at her. I sat sat up in bed. I reminded him that his mother had spent months telling people I had trapped him. I reminded him she had implied I had cheated and that a Magagan wasn't his. I reminded him she had pushed for a paternity test despite our daughter's face being definitive proof. He said he knew all of that. He wasn't trying to excuse her. He was just struggling. We argued, our first real fight about his mother since he had ended contact. Arlo said perhaps supervised visits were possible if she gave a proper apology. I said her tears over photos didn't cancel out months of calling. I said crying because she was missing her granddaughter was not the same thing as being sorry for destroying my reputation. He said he understood that but wanted to at least hear her out. I got up from the bed. I told him his mother hadn't yet done anything to earn forgiveness. She was grieving consequences, not acknowledging harm. He said he knew I was right, but he was exhausted from being caught in the middle. I told him I was equally exhausted from being painted as the villain simply for protecting myself and our daughter from someone who had deliberately spread vicious lies about me. We went back and forth in low voices, careful not to wake a Magagan in the next room. Neither of us raised our voices, but the anger was real and sharp between us. I slept on the couch. In the morning, Arlo came and sat beside me. He apologized. He said he hadn't been trying to pressure me. He was simply struggling with missing his mother while remaining furious at her. He said the work stress was making everything feel more unbearable. I told him I understood. I told him I didn't want to be the reason he lost his relationship with her entirely. He took my hand and said any path toward reconciliation would require genuine accountability from Pette, not just sadness about what she was missing, but real acknowledgement of the specific harm she had caused. He said I had final say on when and whether she ever met Magagan. He said my comfort and safety mattered more than his mother's feelings. The tightness in my chest eased slightly. The morning light came through the windows and we sat there holding hands in the quiet. Later that week, Natasha took me out for coffee while Arlo stayed home with Magagan. I needed to be somewhere outside those walls. I needed to talk to someone with no emotional ties to Pette. We settled into a corner booth and I told her everything. Stuart's phone call, Arlo's question about whether we were being too harsh, our argument, and the guilt I couldn't seem to shake about holding the line. Natasha listened without cutting in once. When I finished, she leaned forward. She reminded me that Pette had accused me of entrapment and infidelity to anyone willing to hear it. She reminded me that Pette had tried to convince Arlo to demand a paternity test for a baby whose face was unmistakably his. She said protecting myself and my daughter from that level of toxicity was not cruelty. She said Pette had constructed this entire situation entirely on her own. She said I didn't owe forgiveness to someone who had spent months actively trying to destroy my marriage and my reputation. Being the bigger person didn't mean allowing toxic people to walk over me. Boundaries weren't punishment. They were protection. I drove home feeling steadier in myself. That evening, Arlo and I sat down together at the dining table and had a calmer conversation about what accountability from his mother would actually have to look like. We agreed it meant a direct apology to me specifically, not through intermediaries, not through emotional phone calls, but a genuine face-to-face acknowledgement of the specific harm she had caused. We agreed it meant changed behavior sustained over time, not a single conversation followed by an expectation of instant normalcy. We agreed she needed to actively correct the lies she had spread, go back to the same people who had heard her accusations and tell them plainly that she had been wrong. We wrote everything down in clear language, no room for ambiguity. Arlo said he would communicate these requirements directly to his parents. If his mother couldn't meet them, the arrangement would continue. The weekend came. I took Magagan to the park near our apartment. She adored being outside, kicking her legs and making excited sounds whenever she spotted trees or birds overhead. I took photos of her laughing in her stroller, her smile enormous, her eyes bright. I posted the best one on social media with a simple caption about the spring weather. Within an hour, several of Arlo's friends from high school had commented, asking if we had used a filter, marveling at how strongly genetics had expressed themselves. She was Arlo's exact replica, they said. The post spread. I watched it appear in the family group chat. I knew Pette would see it. I didn't care anymore. That evening, my phone rang from an unknown number. Something made me answer. Pette's voice came through the speaker, barely recognizable, breaking apart between sobs so heavy she could hardly form words. She kept saying she had been wrong. She kept saying she needed to see her granddaughter. The words came out in fragments between gasps. I stood in my kitchen holding the phone slightly away from my ear. I felt anger rising in me. I also felt something unexpected and unwanted, a flicker of pity hearing her come apart this completely. She begged me to keep listening. She said she was sorry over and over. She said she had been looking at photos of a Magagan all week and finally understood the magnitude of what she had thrown away. I took a slow breath. I told Pette I wasn't able to have this conversation right now. I said if she wanted to apologize, she needed to do it properly, not through a sobbing phone call that felt manipulative regardless of her intentions. She begged me not to hang up. I ended the call anyway. My hands were shaking when I set the phone on the counter. Arlo walked in 20 minutes later and found me on the couch, staring at nothing. He dropped his bag and came straight to me. I explained the call. His face shifted instantly into that particular expression. Protective, quietly furious, jaw tight. I described the sobbing, the desperate repetition, the way she kept saying she was wrong without actually naming any of the specific things she had done. Arlo called his father immediately. He told Stuart directly that Pette needed to respect our boundaries and stop making dramatic gestures that transferred pressure onto me. He said calling me directly to cry cry was not acceptable, and that all communication needed to be routed through him. Stuart's voice came through loudly enough for me to catch pieces. He was defending Pette, saying she was genuinely sorry, and that we were being cruel by keeping her from her grandchild when she was clearly in pain. Arlo told his father calmly and precisely that Pette's suffering was a consequence of her own choices. He said she had spent months calling me a liar and suggesting I had been unfaithful to him. He said a sobbing phone call was not an apology or accountability. Stuart tried to interrupt. Arlo kept going. He said if his mother wanted back into their lives, she needed to take real responsibility for what she had done, not cry about how badly she felt, not make me feel guilty for protecting myself and our daughter. Stuart said they were being unreasonable. Arlo ended the call. The apartment felt tense for several days after that. Arlo was carrying stress from a deteriorating project at work on top of the weight of the family situation. I felt a low, persistent guilt I knew I shouldn't feel but couldn't entirely shake. The awareness that I was standing between Arlo and his mother, even knowing she had put herself there. Imagigan sensed the tension somehow, the way babies always do. She became fussier than usual, needing to be held constantly, resisting naps, crying more often. Managing a fussy baby through the fog of family drama and unresolved guilt made everything harder than it needed to be. Arlo and I were short with each other in ways that weren't like us. Small things became unnecessary friction. We apologized and meant it, but the underlying tension lingered. My phone rang Thursday morning while I was feeding Imagigan. I almost didn't answer the unknown number, but it was Jacqueline's voice when I picked up. She wanted to talk, woman to woman, she said, not to pressure me, but to share something honestly. I agreed to meet her the next day. I walked into the coffee shop Friday afternoon and found her already at a corner table with a latte waiting for me. We made small talk about Imagigan for a few minutes. Then Jacqueline told me the real reason she had reached out. She said Pette's collapse after seeing the photos had been completely genuine. She said Pette had been telling family members she was wrong about me. She said Pette was deeply ashamed and didn't know how to repair what she had broken. I listened carefully but without softening. I told Jacqueline that a sincere apology wasn't complicated if someone genuinely meant it. Pette knew how to reach us. She knew what was required. Telling other family members she was sorry didn't address what she had done to me. Jacqueline acknowledged it and admitted that pride had always been Pette's greatest flaw, that she wanted to apologize but didn't know how to do it in a way that felt proportionate to the harm she had caused. My patience reached its edge. I told Jacqueline that Pette's pride was not mine to manage. I wasn't going to make this easier for her when she had made my life so deliberately difficult. I reminded Jacqueline of the specifics, the entrapment accusations, the infidelity implications, the paternity test demands for a baby who wore Arlo's face. These were not small misunderstandings or momentary lapses. These were calculated, sustained lies designed to damage my reputation and destabilize my marriage. Jacqueline looked down at her coffee and said she understood why I was angry. She said she would be too. I went home and told Arlo everything. He listened while bouncing Imagigan on his knee. When I finished, he said his mother needed to do the hard work herself without sending people ahead to test the waters. We talked through what we actually wanted from Pette and agreed that if she was serious about making amends, she needed to write me a letter, not a text, not a phone call, a written letter taking full and specific accountability for every accusation she had made. She needed to name the things she had done, explain why, and apologize for the damage caused without making excuses. Arlo sent a message to his parents that evening making the requirement explicit, not a guarantee of reconciliation, just the first required step. Stuart responded within the hour, calling the demand excessive and formal. Arlo replied that if a sincere written apology was too much to ask, the arrangement would simply continue. Stuart didn't respond again after that. 2 weeks went by without a letter. I began accepting that Pette's breakdown had been about her own loss, not genuine remorse for what she had put me through. Arlo seemed both relieved and quietly disappointed. We stopped discussing it. Life moved into its normal rhythms. Imagigan learned to roll from her back to her stomach, and we celebrated that milestone loudly and completely without thinking about Pette at all. Then a letter arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. I recognized the return address, and my hand started shaking as I opened the envelope. The paper inside was nice stationery with Pette's name printed along the top. Her handwriting covered 3 full pages. I sat down before I began reading. The letter was thorough and specific. She wrote about telling family members I had trapped Arlo with a pregnancy. She wrote about implying I had been unfaithful and suggesting Imagigan might not be his. She wrote about pushing for a paternity test when the resemblance to Arlo was obvious to anyone who looked. She admitted being completely wrong about all of it. She wrote that she had felt threatened by how completely Arlo had chosen me, and how whole our small family seemed without any input or approval from her. She admitted she had tried to manufacture doubt because if she could make everyone question my character, she could convince herself her original judgment of me had been correct all along. She wrote that the recent photos forced her to confront that she had been lying to herself and everyone else, driven entirely by insecurity and a need for control that had nothing to do with me. She wrote that she understood if I never forgave her. She said what she had done was unforgivable, and she knew it. I read the letter 3 full times. Parts of it felt unmistakably real. Parts of it sounded like what someone writes when they know what they're supposed to say. Words are easy. What matters is what comes after them. I carried it to the kitchen where Arlo was feeding Imagigan and mashed sweet potato. He set down the spoon, wiped his hands, and read every page without speaking. When he finished, he placed the letter carefully on the counter and looked at it for a long moment. He said it was the most accountable he had ever seen his mother be about anything in his entire life. He said she had never admitted being so thoroughly wrong before. He thought maybe she was actually capable of change. I told him I wanted to believe that too, but we needed to be careful. He agreed immediately. We talked it through after Imagigan went down for her nap. The letter was a meaningful first step, but it wasn't an arrival point. We couldn't simply fold her back into our lives because she had written a compelling apology. We needed to see whether she would demonstrate changed behavior consistently over time, or whether this was one more manipulation dressed up in better language. Arlo called his mother that evening with me sitting beside him. He told her the letter had arrived and that he appreciated its honesty. He said rebuilding trust would require sustained demonstration of changed behavior, not just words. Silence on the other end. Then Pette said she understood. She said she would do whatever was necessary and for however long it took. Her voice was smaller than I had ever heard it, less certain, less performed. Arlo asked her to actively correct the lies she had spread about me with every family member who had heard them. If she was genuinely committed to making amends, she needed to repair the damage to my reputation directly. Pette agreed without a single argument. That surprised both of us. She asked if she could send Imagigan a small gift. Arlo looked at me. I thought about it briefly and nodded. He told her she could send something modest to our address. The call ended quietly shortly after. We sat together in the stillness of our living room, and I felt something shift. Not relief exactly. Not hope quite yet, but a loosening of the tension that had lived in my chest for months. A week passed. Imagigan learned to clap her hands, and we celebrated like she had achieved something remarkable. Life continued in its ordinary, beautiful rhythm of feedings and naps and small milestones that felt enormous. Then a package arrived from Pette's address. I opened it carefully on the kitchen counter with Arlo watching over my shoulder. Inside was a baby blanket in soft yellow yarn with neat white edging, handmade, the stitching careful and deliberate. Beside it lay a children's book about a family of rabbits and a small note card. Pette had written that she made the blanket herself, remembering how Arlo had loved soft blankets as a baby, and hoping Imagigan might too. The gesture carried more weight than an expensive purchase would have. It felt like actual effort, time and intention instead of money. I ran my fingers across the texture of the yarn and felt something shift fractionally in my chest. Not forgiveness, not trust, just a small, cautious softening toward the possibility that reconciliation might eventually become something real. Arlo spread the blanket over Imagigan during her next nap. She grabbed the edge immediately and pulled it close to her face. I took a photo and saved it without sending it to anyone. 2 days later, Fletcher called. Arlo put him on speaker while I stood at the sink washing bottles. Fletcher said Pette had been actively going back to extended family members and correcting the record. She was telling them plainly that she had been completely wrong about me. She was saying that she had damaged a good person's reputation because of her own unresolved issues. Fletcher said he had heard this independently from 3 different relatives. Pette wasn't just apologizing to us privately, she was doing the uncomfortable public work of dismantling what she had built. She was admitting fault to people who might judge her for it. This mattered in a way the letter alone couldn't. It was behavior. It was evidence. It was Pette being willing to be embarrassed and accountable in the same circles where she had once spread her lies so carefully. Arlo thanked Fletcher and hung up. I stood at the sink with my hands in soapy water, trying to understand what I was feeling. Later that afternoon, I called Natasha and met her at the coffee shop, while Arlo stayed with Imagigan. I told her everything, and the letter, the blanket, Fletcher's call. I asked her whether I was being too careful or not careful enough. Natasha stirred her coffee and looked at me with real directness. She said I got to control the terms of any reconciliation, and that making Pette earn back trust was not only appropriate but necessary. Being the bigger person had never meant allowing myself to be walked over. Boundaries were protection, not punishment. She said those things I'd already heard before but needed to hear again. I drove home feeling settled. That evening, Arlo and I sat at the dining table with a notebook between us and wrote out specific, non-negotiable conditions for any future contact with Pette. She could never speak negatively about me to any family member again. All visits would be supervised. She was required to respect our parenting decisions without offering unsolicited criticism. Any return to her previous behavior patterns would result in immediate return to no contact. We wrote everything in plain language, signed our names at the bottom, and Arlo scanned and emailed a copy to his parents. Stuart called within the hour. He said the conditions were excessive. He said Pette had already apologized, and we were treating her like a criminal. Arlo told his father calmly that these were non-negotiable, and that if they couldn't be accepted, the estrangement would continue. Then Pette came on the line. She took the phone from Stuart and told him firmly to be quiet. She said she accepted every condition without reservation. She asked when she might possibly be allowed to meet Imagigan in person. Arlo told her we needed at least another month of demonstrated good behavior before we would consider it. Pette said she understood. During that month, updates filtered through Jacqueline. Pette was continuing to correct her past accusations with extended family members. She had also begun seeing a therapist to address her controlling tendencies and the pride that had driven so much of her behavior. The weeks passed and she remained consistent. She didn't push for a faster timeline. She didn't make excuses or minimize what she had done. She sent brief updates through Jacqueline about her therapy, but didn't use them to request anything in return. I kept waiting for the mask to slip, for the impatient, entitled version of Pette to resurface. Week after week, she stayed steady. I started to wonder whether seeing Imogen's photos had genuinely broken something open in her, whether missing those months had finally made the cost of her pride impossible to ignore. My mom arrived the following weekend with groceries and soup, as she did when she had decided someone needed looking after. She took Imogen from me at the door and carried her to the kitchen, already making grandmother sounds that made the baby smile. We ate lunch together at the kitchen table with Imogen and her bouncer between us. After we finished, I told my mom everything. The letter, the conditions, Stuart's reaction, Pette's acceptance, the therapy reports coming through Jacqueline. My mom listened with full attention. When I finished, she squeezed my hand across the table. She said she was proud of me for holding firm on boundaries while still leaving a door open if Pette proved she had genuinely changed. She told me to protect myself and my daughter always. And she warned me to watch carefully for any signs of the old patterns returning, because words and sustained behavior were very different things. She told me to trust my own instincts and never let guilt override my judgment about what was safe for Imogen. I needed to hear that more than I realized. 6 weeks moved slowly, but Pette maintained everything she had committed to throughout every one of them. She continued correcting the record with family members. She continued attending therapy. She sent one brief note through Jacqueline asking simply whether the blanket had arrived and hoping Imogen had liked it, but she pushed for nothing more and complained about nothing at all. Arlo and I circled back to the same question during those weeks repeatedly, whether his mother was genuinely transforming or performing transformation to regain access to what she had lost. Finally, we agreed to try a supervised meeting at the park 3 blocks from our apartment. The location felt right, open enough that we could leave immediately if needed, neutral enough that Pette couldn't create a scene or corner us anywhere. Jacqueline offered to come as a quiet presence and we accepted, knowing that having a witness made the whole thing feel safer. She promised to stay nearby but give us room, ready to step in at any sign of Pette's old behavior. We scheduled it for a Saturday morning at 10, leaving ourselves the entire rest of the day to decompress if we needed it. The night before, I barely slept. Every scenario ran through my mind in the dark. Whether Pette could hold her resentment back, whether some passive-aggressive comment would surface underneath a compliment, whether she would try to take Imogen from my arms and assert some grandmother's right to hold her first. Every time I began to drift off, another worry pulled me back to the ceiling. Arlo woke around 3 in the morning and found me sitting up in bed. He pulled me back down against his chest and wrapped his arms around me. He promised we would leave the moment his mother showed any sign of reverting. He reminded me that I was in control of this meeting, that Pette was only being allowed this because I was choosing to allow it. His voice was steady and calm in the dark, and I finally fell asleep sometime around 4, with his hand moving in slow circles on my back. Saturday morning arrived faster than I was ready for. We got Imogen dressed and packed her bag with supplies. Arlo loaded the stroller while I buckled her into her car seat. Neither of us said much during the short drive. Jacqueline was already there when we arrived, sitting on a bench near the playground with a coffee cup, waving when she spotted us but giving us space to get settled at our own pace. The park was full of other families enjoying the spring morning, children running through the playground, parents pushing swings, and the normalcy of it all felt surreal against the weight of what we were about to do. We walked slowly toward the meeting point, and then I saw her. Pette was sitting alone on a bench near the fountain in a simple blue sweater I had never seen before. She looked smaller than I remembered her, older, her shoulders curved forward like she was trying to take up less space. When she spotted us approaching with the stroller, she stood immediately but didn't move toward us. Her hand rose to her mouth. Even from a distance, I could see the tears already building. She began crying before we had crossed half the distance between us, and every muscle in my body went tense. I still couldn't tell whether this was genuine or performed. We stopped about 10 feet away, and Arlo's hand found mine. Pette remained where she was, crying but not approaching, and I understood in that moment that she was waiting for permission. Arlo cleared his throat and told her she could come closer to see Imogen. She walked toward us carefully, like she was afraid that moving too quickly would cause us to change our minds. When she reached the stroller, she knelt beside it instead of standing over it, putting herself at Imogen's level. She looked at our daughter without saying anything for a long moment. Imogen was awake and alert, her unusual eyes following the movement of other children across the park. Pette's hand hovered near the stroller frame but didn't touch it. Then she spoke, her voice rough and quiet. She said Imogen was beautiful. She said she looked exactly like Arlo had as a baby. The same nose, the same chin, the same eyes. There was no defensiveness in how she said it. No trace of the woman who had insisted for months the resemblance didn't exist. Just sadness and what sounded unmistakably like remorse. I studied her carefully. I searched for the subtle jabs wrapped in warmth, the passive-aggressive undertones and compliments, the cold assessment hiding behind her eyes when she looked at me. I found none of it. Pette looked genuinely humbled and ashamed kneeling beside that stroller. After a moment, she looked up at me, tears still running. She said she was sorry for everything she had put me through. She said she had been wrong about me from the very beginning, from the first family dinner when she had decided I wasn't sufficient for her son. She said she understood completely if I never fully forgave her because what she had done was unforgivable. Her voice broke on that last word, and I felt something shift deep in my chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but perhaps the beginning of believing she might actually mean it. Arlo asked his mother, quietly and directly, why she had spread those lies about me. Pette kept kneeling but turned to look at him. She said she had felt herself losing control over her son's life and couldn't make peace with the fact that he had chosen someone without her approval. She admitted she had spent his entire childhood building an image of the woman he would marry, someone from their social world, from the right kind of family. And when he brought me home instead, she couldn't surrender that fantasy. The pregnancy made it impossible to keep pretending. So she had tried to manufacture doubt about my character, because if she could convince everyone else to question me, she could keep telling herself her original judgment had been right. Seeing Imagigan's recent photos, seeing how completely and obviously she was Arlo's daughter, had forced her to face that. She had been lying to herself and everyone around her because of her own insecurity and desperate need for control. Her hands were trembling as she spoke. I could see what it cost her to say these things out loud. The visit lasted about 40 minutes. Pette maintained appropriate distance throughout. She never reached into the stroller or attempted to hold Imagigan without being invited. She asked thoughtful, genuine questions about her development, when she had started sleeping through the night, how her appetite was, whether she had started teething yet. When Imagigan began to fuss, Pette stepped back quietly to give me space to pick her up and settle her. She watched me hold our daughter against my shoulder, and something in her expression looked genuinely wistful rather than calculating. By the time we began gathering to leave, I had started to believe she might actually be capable of what she was claiming. As we got ready to go, Pette asked quietly whether a second visit might be possible in a few weeks. Her voice was hesitant, careful not to push too far. Arlo looked at me and waited. I thought about the past 40 minutes, the respectful distance, the permission asked before everything, the absence of anything that felt like her old self. I told her we could try monthly supervised visits for now. I explained that if she continued respecting our boundaries and treating me with genuine respect, we could talk about gradually increasing contact over time. I made it clearly conditional. Any return to her old behavior meant immediate return to no contact. Pette thanked me with something real in her voice. She said she knew she had to earn back every bit of trust, and that she was prepared to do whatever that required for however long it took. She didn't push for a hug. She didn't suggest hosting the next visit at her house. She didn't ask to hold Imagigan. She just accepted what I offered and thanked us for it. She was still standing on the path watching us as we walked away. For the first time since I had known her, Pette had genuinely respected my boundaries without trying to renegotiate or maneuver her way around them. On the drive home, Imagigan fell asleep in her car seat within minutes. Arlo reached over and held my hand while keeping his eyes on the road. He asked how I was feeling about everything. I told him cautiously optimistic, but still watching. He said he understood completely. Then he told me he was proud of me for allowing his mother this chance despite everything she had done. He said my willingness to leave space for redemption while protecting what mattered most meant everything to him. I looked out the window and told him I wasn't doing it for Pette. I was doing it for him and for Imagigan, because they both deserved the chance at having a grandmother, if she could truly become one. He held my hand tighter, and we drove the rest of the way in silence. Over the next 2 months, we had 3 more supervised visits at the same park. Each one passed without incident. Pette brought small, thoughtful gifts, a soft stuffed rabbit, a set of board books, a musical toy with gentle lullabies. She always asked before taking photos. She stayed at whatever distance we indicated. She complimented Imagigan's development without any implication that it should be credited to anyone other than us. When Imagigan began crawling between visits, Pette celebrated the milestone with genuine delight and no comparisons to Arlo's timeline as a baby. She understood she was on earned probation and that she could not afford a single misstep. Fletcher called one evening to tell us that extended family had been noticing the change in Pette at gathering. She had been consistently shutting down the old accusations whenever anyone raised them. When paternity doubts came up at a cousin's birthday party, Pette had addressed the entire room directly, told them she had been completely wrong, and apologized for spreading lies about a woman who had been a wonderful mother and wife from the very beginning. Fletcher said several relatives had been visibly stunned because Pette had never in living memory admitted being wrong about anything. In the weeks that followed, multiple relatives reached out to me privately to apologize for believing her. I accepted each apology while quietly noting who had stood beside me from the start and who had needed proof to change their position. Arlo and I celebrated our 3rd wedding anniversary at home with Imagigan between us on the couch, playing with her feet and babbling happily. Arlo pulled me close and told me that watching me hold firm on what mattered while still leaving room for his mother's redemption had shown him what genuine strength actually looks like. Our relationship with Pette would likely never become warm or easy in the way some families manage, but we had established a new dynamic, one where I held all the terms and she honored my authority as Imagigan's mother without question. Our little family stayed protected. Supervised visits continued. The tension that had lived in my chest for so long was finally slowly beginning to leave. I looked at our daughter. She had Arlo's eyes and his smile and absolutely no room for doubt about where she had come from. That was more than enough. If you've ever had to prove your worth to someone who had already decided you weren't enough and let your life speak louder than their lies, subscribe. New stories every single week.